Hi, everyone. Thanks for tuning in to this virtual talk for the 2021 Sagan workshop. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about finding young planets with the precision radial velocity technique. Before I get to the science, let me introduce myself. My name is Arpita Roy, and I'm an astronomer at the Space Telescope Science Institute. My science is focused on developing techniques and technologies for detecting exoplanet signatures, particularly those of small planets. So for the last decade or so, I've been part of multiple teams that are developing the next generation of precision radial velocity instruments. Now, my appointment at Space Telescope is 50-50, which means I spend half of my time on ground-based radial velocity work and the other half on mission support. So I am also an instrument scientist for the James Webb Space Telescope. And so I spend about half my time working on commissioning and thinking about exoplanet science with JWST. I mention this because Space Telescope is in the process of hiring for more such tenure track positions right now, and will continue staffing up in the near future. So if this is a kind of position that you're interested in, I encourage you to keep an eye out for those ads. I'll also mention that I'm looking for grad students for my own research group right now. So if you or anyone you know is interested in working on precision radial velocities, please feel free to get in touch with me. So let's start by laying a bit of background about how the field of exoplanets has evolved and where we find ourselves at this moment of time in 2021. This animation shows the history of exoplanet detection starting from the early 1700s to about present day. As I start this, you'll see that for the first couple of 100 years, there's not a lot of excitement. We are still discovering the outer solar system planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto still on here. And then in 1995, a profound transformation happens, and the first radial velocity detection of an exoplanet, 51 Peg b, is made, and really the field of exoplanet studies is established. Then there is a stream of single planet discoveries that are hard fought given the technology of the time until 2003, when this first red dot arrives, which is the first transiting planet discovery. Again, another leap in technology that happens. This kind of work continues until about 2009 when Kepler is launched, and you'll see in the years following there is sort of an explosion in these red dots that represent the transiting planets, showing just how prolific Kepler was in finding new planets. And so this is where we stand now with a few thousand planets under our belt and the ability to ask questions about planet demographics, planet formation, and evolution. But you'll see here in this plot that it is not uniformly populated, and that does not necessarily reflect the occurrence rates of planets, but rather our own detection limits. And so rocky planets, planets like the Earth, small planets, are still kind of at the edge of our detection capability, and most of them lie beyond it. So a lot of the work we're doing now is to try to push our detection limits so that we can get a fuller census of the exoplanets that are out there. So let me tell you a little bit about the precision radial velocity technique itself, which is what I use and what we're focusing on in this talk. And I'll introduce here an acronym that we're going to use quite a bit, which is a pretty new term, which is EPRV, or extreme precision radial velocity. And that word extreme here indicates that we are moving past the original planet hunting instruments with RV that were at about the 1 meter per second level, to an order of magnitude improvement aiming at 10 centimeters per second, which is the signature that the Earth imposes on our sun. So here is a basic animation showing how the radial velocity technique works. Both the planet and the star are orbiting a common center of mass of the system. So as the planet makes a large orbit, the star actually also, in response to the planet's gravitational pull, makes a very small orbit. We often call that the wobble of the star. And so as the star wobbles, its spectral lines Doppler shift back and forth into the red and the blue over time. And by measuring these very small shifts, we can carve out the period of the planet and the star and infer the mass of the planet that is causing the wobble in the star. Now, 10 centimeters per second is a very small signature to look at. A kind of real world analogy that I like to use is that of a desert tortoise. So that is slow. Tortoises are known for moving very slow, much slower than you would move. And this is the range of motion we are trying to detect in a star that is light years away, which is kind of an incredible challenge. Perhaps a more physics-based analogy of this is to look at this silicon lattice. So this is a very high resolution electron microscope image of a silicon wafer, which is sort of the thing you find in your CCD or actually even in your cell phone camera often. And this shows what 10 centimeters per second motion across the silicon atoms looks like. So that is something like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 atoms worth of motion. So even on an atomic scale, this is a very, very small displacement that we're trying to measure. If you zoom out a little bit from the atomic scale onto the pixel scale of your detector, if you had a single pixel, you actually wouldn't see this motion in the spectral lines at all. Because this motion is very subpixel. It's something like 1 in 6,000th of a pixel. The only way we get around this is by looking at thousands of lines from the star and distributing them out, spreading them out over millions of pixels. So even though this is such a great challenge, the radial velocity community has risen to it. And actually in the last few years and in the next coming few years, there are 23 new ground-based RV spectrographs that are being commissioned. This is really quite an army of new technology that is coming online. And so what I'm showing here on this timeline is all of these instruments and their goal precisions over time, as well as some of the space missions that are studying exoplanets and when they are launched relative to these ground-based instruments. And so actually standing here in 2021, we are more or less on schedule for most of these instruments as they were projected to be back in 2017. I'll also point out that at this level of precision, these are not just simple spectrometers anymore. These are really complex systems rather than single monolithic instruments. And they're composed of many subsystems spanning both hardware and software, as well as the telescope and the whole observatory facility. So here is the Keck Planet Finder system, and we won't go into detail very much, but just to show you that how the telescope behaves will influence your detection limits. All of these subsystems, including the fiber feed that takes the light from the telescope to the basement where the instrument lives. The instrument itself is a spectrograph on a glass bench, and it sits inside a vacuum chamber that sits inside a thermal enclosure. Beside it is a very critical component called the calibration unit, which provides many different calibrators, including a laser frequency comb. But then also an important part of this whole system is the pipeline, the data reduction pipeline that takes the raw data, processes it through some very sophisticated algorithms and outputs actually many different measurements of the radial velocity. And so when you ask for an observation of a star, it passes through this full system before giving you values that you can use to try and detect exoplanets. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the philosophy behind these extreme precision systems. So unlike some instruments in the past that were retrofitted for exoplanet work, these are custom built to be highly stabilized precision radial velocity machines. And so an important part of the philosophy is that we stabilize everything possible in hardware. There are things you can't fix post build. And so you really have to spend the extra dollar trying to make the hardware as stable as possible. But then you still have some leverage left, which is your software. And so you correct everything possible in the software that the hardware couldn't damp out. Ideally, once you do this, you don't then touch the system for the lifetime of its survey, because the whole history of the instrument's behavior actually influences every observation that you take. Another important aspect of designing these extreme precision systems is to kind of systems engineer the expectations from it. So we are beyond the era of single dominant sources of error. And so we need to understand, measure, and manage every possible source of error. There are no tall poles anymore. There is a forest of small poles, really. And so instead of saying, how do we get to 30 centimeters or 10 centimeters per second, we say, what are all of the systematics that matter, and how well can we characterize and control them, and then what is the precision that we get to. So here is an early version of the NUID error budget, and you'll see it's at just below 27 centimeters per second. And the good news I can tell you sort of as a spoiler ahead of time is that we are seeing that level of performance in the as-built instrument. So we've been building these instruments and designing them, and finally now we are at the point where we are able to deliver them to the observatories. So this is another instrument that I worked on. It's a near-infrared instrument called the Habitable Zone Planet Finder. Here it is arriving at the Hobby-Eberly Telescope in Texas. And an interesting part of instrument building that doesn't get talked about a lot is the actual transportation of the instrument once you've built it, which can be a rather nerve-wracking process. But FedEx has a pretty good white glove delivery service that will bring your multi-million-dollar instrument to the observatory. And here it is lifting up that several-ton instrument on a jig and placing it inside the basement of the Hobby-Eberly Telescope. So we've talked about building the next generation of instruments and getting the data, but I'd like to tell you a little bit more about how we actually measured the EPRVs from the spectra, because this will become relevant when we go from regular older stars to the younger stars. So we get raw data from the Echelle spectrograph, and if you've never seen Echelle spectra before, this is a rather complex focal plane. For NUID, we extract about 117 spectral orders, and each spectral order is composed of 3 fibers. You'll see in the zoomed out images here, there is a science fiber, which has the starlight, as you can see there, which is mostly continuum with a few absorption lines. And then there is this very uniform row of dots that is produced by the laser frequency comb, that is our wavelength and stability calibrator. And the third fiber that you can't see very well here is the sky fiber that allows us to correct for sky emission lines and also somewhat for other kinds of contamination like moonlight. I'll also mention that even though this looks very complex, you can kind of read it like a book. So the wavelengths go from left to right and top to bottom, from the blue to the red. So we take this pretty complex looking 2D focal plane image and pass it through our very sophisticated pipeline that goes through some of the steps you've perhaps heard of before in terms of looking at spectra. We do some image processing, we do spectral extraction, we do wavelength calibration, but then there's a lot of extra steps that you need to do for precision radial velocity work, including the treatment of the sky, the treatment of Earth's motion, and actually to the level of the photon arrival times, depending on the color of the photon. Let me show you a little bit what those steps look like. So here is the extraction from raw 2D data. There's extensive image corrections and a variety of extraction techniques that are used, from optimal extraction to flat relative extraction. But at the end of whatever choice you make with extraction, you basically get something that looks like the bottom panel. This is one order of the NUID spectrum. This is actually a spectrum of the sun. And then you go through a very extensive process of correcting for the time-based behavior of the instrument by wavelength calibrating it to that moment in time, using something like a laser frequency comb or an Echelle, or if all fails, a lamp, as we used to do in the last generation. And you essentially assign colors to pixels, but with very high fidelity. Lastly, we calculate the radial velocity value of a single epoch using cross-correlation with a stellar mask. What we basically do here is select a subset of lines that seem stable and pass them over the stellar spectrum such that you build up a cross-correlation function that represents an average stellar line. The principle underlying this work is that true bulk motion caused by the presence of a planet makes all of the stellar lines move in an identical way without changing their shape. And so we pick the best areas rich in RV information. These are deep, clean lines that also avoid telluric regions. And this works well for FGK stars that have well-defined lines and continua. However, it gets much trickier for M dwarfs due to the lack of clean lines and really not great models for predicting what the spectra looks like at this level of precision. I'll also mention that these masks or line lists can evolve over time as our understanding of what the best stable lines really are grows as we collect more data. Once we have individual radial velocity measurements, the next challenge is to look at our radial velocity behavior over time. And so something that all of these instruments do is to verify their precision on SCI. And so one of the targets that NUID uses for this is the sun, and NUID looks at the sun every day. The sun is a very interesting target because it provides this homogeneous, high signal to noise, predictable data set every day that allows for both calibration of the instrument and a rather interesting data set in its own right in terms of stellar activity. But it also, because it's so high signal to noise, the exposures are pretty short. And so this allows us to track short-term variability on the order of minutes, as well as long-term variability on the orders of months to years. And so for a perfectly quiet star, this plot that I'm showing you on the top with time on the x-axis and radial velocity measurements on the y-axis, should show only instrument-driven variability. But of course, in reality, anytime you're looking at a real star, you have noise from the star as well as noise from the instrument. That was the sun. This is another star on NUID. This is Tau Ceti, sort of a typical RV standard. And you can see here that the noise levels are a little bit different from the sun. The cadence at which we can observe it is different from the sun, but these are complementary data sets in trying to constrain instrument performance versus stellar activity. So the good news is that we have been finishing the build of these instruments, bringing them to the observatory and commissioning them. And once on SCI, it looks like these instruments are achieving their predicted precisions, which is pretty fantastic. However, the bad news is that now we are limited by things that used to be mostly below our detection threshold. And so we're limited by noise from the star that is not well understood at this level. So let's talk about the stars. Real stars have real problems. And this is where we dive into the conundrum that is stellar activity. In the decades since the first discovery of planets, we used to be instrument limited. So the bubble of instrumental noise sources used to dominate most other things, including the star, Earth-based problems that include the motion of the Earth and the atmosphere, and the 10 centimeter per second signals were buried deep in this plethora of noise sources. However, with a decade of work, the new generation of instruments have managed to shrink this instrument-based error bubble. And so what we're left with now is a stellar-based dominance in the error budget. And these are not the final relative errors that one has to deal with, since you still can do something in software to shrink these bubbles and bring them closer to the 10 centimeter per second level. But clearly a lot of our effort needs to go into the biggest bubble, which is the stellar-based noise sources. So what are these stellar-based noise sources? This is a graphic I made to try and show what the dominant sources of noise are that we worry about, the level at which we worry about them, and the timescales on which they occur. So in the few minutes level, there are pre-modes, the pressure modes in the sun. As you go longer into hours and days, you see granulation. On the approximately months-long timescale, you see stellar spots and their bright counterparts, which are faculae. And then as you go into the years to decades timescale, you see the long magnetic cycles that for the sun, for example, happen at around 11 years. The only source of noise that is somewhat below our detection threshold and level of concern is gravitational redshift. But for all of these other ones, if I put Earth on the map here, you'll see these are larger than Earth-like planet signals. And so these are all signals that you want to correct out or at least dampen before you look for your planet. And you'll also notice that these happen at different time scales. And so if your observations are not sampling all of these time scales adequately, you won't be able to characterize those signals well. To complicate things further, these signals are also not constant over time. So for example, the spot pattern of a star changes over time. And so it matters when you look at the star, what kind of activity pattern you see. There are a few practices to combat stellar activity. Some of these are traditional methods that have been used in RV surveys so far. Things like basically starting with a quiet star list, those that have lower levels of activity. We also try to observe for long enough to average over P-mode oscillations. And we also avoid periods that are contaminated by stellar activity. So if you know the rotation period of the star, you kind of don't try to claim a planet there or at the aliases of those activity timescales. However, these all bring their own limitations to the planet search landscape. So when one tries to target quiet stars, as we said before, activity is variable. And so a star that is quiet at one time might not be quiet at a different time. This also causes biased target selection for large surveys. As we try to average over P-mode oscillations, it can often get tricky to balance the P-mode times with photon collection times, because you kind of want to fill up your pixel wells with about the same number of photons every time for a given star. Otherwise, you see systematics from the CCD or your H2RG chip. And also when avoiding periods contaminated by stellar activity, a lot of interesting parameter space is often made inaccessible. For example, if your rotation timescale coincides with the habitable zone orbital periods. So while these have sort of worked in the last generation, we want to chip away at these limitations and try to understand stellar activity better so that we can correct it out rather than try to ignore it. So of course, in this conference, we're talking about young systems, and young stars actually cause a lot more problems, as I'll describe. So young planets, of course, are found around young stars. Planets are formed in the protoplanetary disks around these young stars. And with a plethora of new instruments, we are seeing how these disks of gas and dust are slowly etched over time by the planets that are forming in them. So these young planets live in very violent, poorly understood environments, and we're still collecting sort of the zoo of disk morphologies that can be seen that often have planets embedded in them. Even as we learn more about how planets form, there are still lots of gaps in planet formation theory, and a big one is the existence of hot Jupiters themselves. Of course, the first exoplanet discovered was a hot Jupiter, which was very surprising at the time, given expectations based on the solar system and doubted in the beginning as a false positive. But over time, we found lots of hot Jupiters. And in fact, they still represent a large fraction of all the exoplanets we have discovered to date, something like 15%. But it turns out hot Jupiters are not as common as smaller planets. So their occurrence rate is expected to be something more like 1%. This discrepancy between the fraction that we've discovered and the total fraction that probably exists has to do with our observing bias, where our techniques are better at finding large close-in planets. But still, the existence of hot Jupiters poses a real challenge to planet formation theory. Classical theories based on the solar system, for example, cannot quite explain the presence of such large planets so close to the parent star. Several ideas have been put forward to try to explain this population of planets, one of which, perhaps a more simple one, is to think about in situ formation, where the planet forms in the vicinity of the host star and remains there. However, this is not quite compatible with solar nebula theory, since that theory posits that there might not be enough material in the inner disk to form these planets. While there have been other explanations put forward that might make in situ formation viable, it cannot quite explain all of the variety of misalignments, high eccentricities, and lack of small companions that we see to these hot Jupiters, which suggest a more violent dynamic history in these systems. The other two theories have the planets forming farther out in the disk and then moving in by some mechanism. So the first one, disk migration, has the planet moving in due to interactions with the disk itself. The last one, dynamical interaction, has to do with a third body that comes in and ricochets the planet from the outer disk to the inner disk, and then tidal interactions with the star tend to circularize the orbit. What's important, though, is that none of these theories individually can explain the full ensemble of properties that we observe for these giant planet populations. And so the key to understanding what is happening in these early times is to observe systems that are in these early phases. So observing young systems is the key to resolving this puzzle, with the hope that we might catch planet migration in action, or really we should be able to narrow down the timescale where it happens if we see systems before and after migration. Young planets, fortunately, are great targets for direct detection. So young planets are hot. They're still forming worlds, which means they're bright in the infrared with light of their own. And so if you can block out the light of the star, the shining planet itself emerges in your data. So large forming planets, well separated from their stars, are actually ideal targets for current direct detection instruments, which right now are going out and finding lots of these systems. However, young stars that host these young planets are not easy targets for radial velocity. So as I said before, these early type stars are typically excluded from RV surveys. And there's a few reasons these stars are such difficult targets for RVs. First of all, these young stars are generally fast rotators, and the radial velocity information content is tied to the slopes of spectral lines. And so the sharper and deeper your spectral line, the more precision you can get out of it. High V sin I's for these stars means that the lines are blended out, which decreases the maximum precision that you can get to on these spectra. Also, typical expectations of Gaussian lines can break down because many lines in these stars are saturated or strongly affected by magnetic fields. Most importantly, the biggest problem is that these stars are intrinsically more active. So they have high stellar jitter, which means that the radial velocity signature that you see is dominated by stellar variability, which is caused by large, bright and dark features on the surface of the star, linked to complex dynamo processes and strong magnetic fields that are actually not super well understood. These stellar signatures can be at about the kilometer per second level. And so given that smaller to medium-sized planets are in the meter per second or sub-meter per second level, the star can completely hide the planets that it hosts. In fact, several false positive detections have been reported around young stars in the past, making people a little bit hesitant to study these systems with RV. However, we should still target young systems with radial velocity, and here's why. It gives us a tool to distinguish between the planet formation theories. So different migration pathways operate on different characteristic timescales, which gives us a way to separate them. So these can be observationally distinguished by measuring the frequency of gas giants over time. To give you a sense of what that timescale looks like, disk migration tends to happen early, of course, when the disk still exists. So at something like the 10 million year or quicker scale, whereas dynamical interactions can happen really anytime, but tend to happen later in the 10 to 10,000 million year timescale. And so observationally, if you are able to see when the hot Jupiter population moves inward, you could perhaps tell which migration technique is more favored. So in combination with direct imaging, radial velocity studies of these systems over time would reveal giant planet occurrence rates across both separation from the star and age of the system. Okay, so we've talked now about building new instruments, how to use that data, and all of the challenges that come with observing real stars. But now let's talk about how we could leverage the next generation of instruments that really provide beautiful, stable spectra with very reliable line profiles. What are the new weapons we have in this battle against stellar activity. So we said that we were now overwhelmed by stellar noise, but the good news is that now we have high fidelity, often high cadence spectra that allows for the characterization of stellar activity as signals that we can correct out rather than noise that we try to average over. So there's a few things we can do to study these young systems and get better results. And one of those is going to the near infrared. So we've always known that for older stars like the sun, stellar jitter is lower in the near infrared than the optical. And a recent paper by Tran et al. Showed that this carries into younger systems as well. So stellar jitter is systematically reduced by a factor of about 2 at young ages. Now, RV variability due to star spots particularly is expected to get better over or diminish over a star's lifetime as the star spins down and its magnetic field weakens. And so you see that in both of the wavelength ranges here, that activity goes down over time. And you can see here that the jitter decays sort of similarly in the optical and the near infrared. But the lower jitter in the near infrared has to do with the reduced star spot to photosphere contrast at longer wavelengths. So star spots are less jarring, less noticeable when you look at the star at redder colors. And so their effect is damped compared to the optical. Other than directly going to the near infrared, another thing you can do is to look at radial velocity over color. So to look at chromatic radial velocities, look at RVs in the near infrared and the optical at the same time. The key here is that activity manifests differently across wavelength, while the presence of a planet does not. And so if you see variability, but it is chromatic, it is likely to be activity. So instruments like NUID that have a broad bandpass, NUID goes from something like 380 to 930. We can actually extract somewhat beyond those limits as well, offers a lot of chromatic leverage in trying to distinguish stellar activity from planet-driven motion. In fact, a very cool plot that I like to show about NUID is that here is the precision of individual NUID Echelle orders over time. And you'll see that the majority of Echelle orders is actually at about the 1 meter per second level, which used to be the cumulative precision that you could get on the last generation of instruments. So single NUID Echelle orders are comparable to whole last generation instrument precisions. This means that you can look at small chunks of wavelength with as high precision as you would look at the white light spectrum of a star before. Another very typical tool in characterizing and measuring stellar activity is canonical lines that we know are activity sensitive. So stabilized spectrographs, of course, offer you those lines, but open up a whole new parameter space when you can think of every single line being an activity indicator at different levels, responding to different types of activity. If you see variability in these lines now, the instruments are so stable that you can attribute that variation to astrophysical causes. So you can connect the line shapes to what is happening directly in the stellar atmosphere. So for example, you can ask questions like, what are the lines that also vary in tandem with the calcium HK indicator? Are there certain species of lines that move together with certain types of stellar activity, whether it be granulation or spots? And then you can also try to resolve line formation at different depths of the atmosphere and think about how lines respond to where, for example, granulation happens or spots happen or plages show up. And so you could imagine classifying lines according to their sensitivity to different types of stellar activity and making custom line lists for measuring different types of activity. Conversely, of course, you would remove these lines from your radial velocity planet searches because you want to use only the lines that are insensitive or as insensitive as possible to stellar activity. We also often have to move beyond typical RV analysis techniques for these young stars. And so here I'm pointing out a few terminologies and techniques that you might see showing up in the literature of young stars. So one leverage that you have with the young stars is that the magnetic fields are very strong. That is both a bad thing and a good thing in terms of trying to model the behavior of these stars. So one tool that is really useful with young stars is spectropolarimetry. So instruments like SPIRU have been doing this, where you can separate the spectra into different polarization states, which gives different line profiles for the different polarization states, and you can look for Zeeman signatures and different axes of magnetic strengths. You can now take those line profiles also and perform Doppler imaging, which basically allows you to reconstruct the surface topology of the large-scale magnetic field, and you can correct your radial velocities by modeling the magnetic field. And this is also a tool to understand the magnetic fields on these stars. Another technique that's being used a lot is Gaussian process regression. This is, of course, becoming common in all sorts of exoplanet science and is a flexible modeling tool for stellar activity, but of course, this should be constrained with physical knowledge of the system where possible. This works quite well for these young stars where the signatures are strong and is sometimes easier to model than with more mature stars. Lastly, these stable instruments also offer the opportunity to look at single lines that might be good tracers of formation phenomena. So for example, helium has been used to study atmospheres that are being blown away from the exoplanet, and H alpha is a good one for looking for accreting planets. Now that we've talked about all of the challenges and all of the tools, let's look at some of the successes of young planet discoveries. So this is a very new field, and so there are only a few planets discovered and almost none with a well-constrained bulk density. There's only about 3 young planet hosting stars found from RV searches, and in fact, 2 of those have been challenged. There's a few more that are from RV derived with spectropolarimetry, with SPIRU specifically, and in combination with transits. But the good news is that there are multiple promising surveys underway. Some of these are the HARPS Young Nearby Stars Survey, a similar survey with SOFI. There is a Habitable Zone Planet Finder Epoch of Giant Planet Migration Program. And there are multiple examples of individual efforts at activity characterization, often using the sun. One that is particularly notable that I'll mention here is the NNExplore EPRV Foundation that recently had a NASA Roses call for funding research specifically to do with mitigating activity, and is also setting up a research network to try and coordinate all of this work. There are also, for example, individual programs on different spectrographs. On NUID, for example, there's one that I'm leading next semester to look at Epsilon Eridani, which is often a favorite young active star for this kind of characterization. A particularly interesting system I'll mention here, kind of as we wrap up, is AU-MIC, which is an active nearby pre-main sequence star. It's very young, it's only about 22 million years, and it has an edge-on debris disk, which makes it kind of an excellent test bed for observing planet formation. Recently, Plavchen et al. Announced a close-in transiting Neptune-sized planet that was discovered from TESS and Spitzer data. And given its edge-on orientation, the fact that the star is bright, the planet is close, AU-MIC is one of the best targets for watching this planet formation in action. However, it has a strong activity signature as expected at about 115 meters per second. So previously, there were only upper limits on the mass, something like 58 Earth masses was the upper limit on the planet. However, more recently in 2021, some SPIRU observations that are leveraging several of these techniques that I just mentioned, going to the near infrared, spectropolarimetry, GPS, Zeeman Doppler imaging, etc., were able to refine the mass and constrain the bulk density, one of the first times this has been done with any level of confidence, to something like more of a 17 Earth mass planet. So because this is a new field, there are big exciting results that are happening right now, really. So I'll end with this closing thought that new fields need new researchers who can use the technology that is being built and develop new analytical methods. And so if you are listening to this talk, you are obviously already interested in this topic. And so I encourage you to get involved following up on the resources presented at this workshop. And again, if you're interested in working in radial velocities in any shape or form, please feel free to get in touch with me. And with that, thank you for listening. I will see some of you at the workshop, and have a good day.